like on Joburg or Pretoria or even Durban.
What do you mean cannot? It has.
Well, if it has, it needs to turn back and face it. I'm not.
Please, you drove to the studio today.
Well,
surely you
I
can see
it. Ramaphosa also Racco. Ramaphosa always chickens out as well in the end.
So you do the old African leadership thing. You send your kids overseas while you loot the country here.
Oh, and look.
It's one thing to have a front row seat to history. It's another thing to be able to write it in probably the most entertaining book that I've read in ages. Tony Leon always seems to capture that moment and put it into words better than anybody I know, certainly in South Africa. And he joins me today while we discuss his latest book, which is a must-read, Being There by Tony Leon. Tony, welcome back to the State of the Nation. So good to see you here.
Thanks so much, Mike, and thank you for your very generous and warm introduction. I hope I live up to it.
No, well,
the book does anyway.
The book has lived up to it. You better not disappoint the book.
I'll be careful.
But Tony, the book, the way I see it is there's kind of like almost 3 sections to it, right? There's some of your interesting visits that you had, largely to Israel, talking there to some very famous people. And then the end is your views on some very popular South Africans. But it's the piece in the middle that I want to kick off with, because you were dragged out of nice retirement almost, or not quite. You were dragged back into politics, I suppose, is the best way. When you got a call on a very crisp late May day after the elections of last year, the national elections, to say that the DA wanted you to be part of their team discussing the government of national unity, or coalition as you thought it was at that point, with the ANC.
Yeah, that was quite a moment. I'd obviously have a relationship with John Steenhuisen, the DA leader, so we'd been in touch, and I'd actually given some advice just before the election, what I thought the party might need to do after the election to maintain momentum. And then we have this extraordinary election result, which I chronicle in the book, which is known to all the viewers as well, which suddenly left the ANC shorn of a parliamentary majority by, some number, right down from 57 to 40 in the between the last election, this election. And John asked me to be one of the DA negotiators to see whether it might be possible to reach an agreement with the ANC about forming a multi-party government called now the GNU. But at that stage, it was a no-name brand, and we didn't even know if the brand would exist because the negotiations were so fraught. And as it happened, and as you discerned, I'd restarted writing this book, Being There, Backstories from the Political Front. And I'd done about 3 sections of it. I talked about those, the journey to Israel and Palestine and Arafat, and Sharon and all that. And then I'd done the next section, the money, which was interesting, about the hair-raising difficulty of raising political funds for the opposition in South Africa. And then I'd done a section on leadership itself, called Leadership Matters. And I was about to get going on the next section, and then the phone rang, as you said. And as I mentioned in the book, and perhaps just worth noting here, I had, of course, been in the previous negotiation round in the 1990s at CODESA, which led to the current constitution. And at that negotiation, which I wrote up in quite some detail in a previous book called On the Contrary, I had, when I was writing it, I wrote that book only in 2007. I was reflecting back on events that happened between 1991 and 1996, that I actually had to go back on sort of looking at memoranda and minutes and press cuttings. And I thought, if I'm ever thrust into that situation again, I'm going to keep a record. And this book reflects what is an accurate daily record of the ins and outs, the back and forth, the dark arts, the lighter moments. But it's entirely my perspective. This is the Tony Leon record. This is not the complete history of how the government was formed, but it's certainly, from my vantage point, it's an accurate one.
Well, the one thing that comes through from that diary is it's comprehensive. But my Lord, you're never going to die of starvation. Everybody seems to invite you out to dinner every night.
Look, it shows, I'm afraid. That, as you can, I do go to gym every day, or I try to anyway.
Well, but and I know I do want to speak about the first and the third parts of the book, but I think that many people would like to hear about the GNU talks, and I know that you've spoken on many platforms about these things, but there were some parts that really struck me. One was that because you had experience of 1994, there must have been some real deja vu, because in so many ways the ANC hauled out the exact playbook and from my vantage point seemed to use exactly the same tactics to get exactly what they wanted yet again.
I think there's a large measure of truth in that, except, of course, the ANC this time were far more disunited. They were a very united party between when they came out of exile in 1990 after F.W. de Klerk unbanned them, and there's a section in the book about that, and the CODESA talks, which ended in 1993, and even the National Assembly, which finalized the Constitution in 96, and I was part of all those processes. And there the ANC really had one face and one voice. The ANC of 2024, when the GNU was being negotiated, completely different animal, highly factionalized, very, very disunited. And as I mentioned in the book, while they were using all those steamroller tactics and they were denying the ability of John to have a direct conversation with Cyril till right at the last moment, and they were trying to keep the most contentious issues till the very end, as I described the night before and the morning of the final vote in Parliament for the president, how they tried to change the terms even if they'd agreed to the night before. All that was vintage ANC. You'll go back to the 1990s. What was different this time is I had some regard for some of the ANC negotiators, Phoebe Potgieter, David Makura, Parks Tau, Ronald Lamola. They were pretty on the level people with us. But I said it was only the tip of an invisible iceberg, and the iceberg was in the ANC NEC. And every time we left a meeting with them, or even when Ramaphosa left a meeting with Steenhuisen, the comrades, the hyenas, would start gnawing away at whatever agreement had been made, and you'd come back 2 days later, and it was like you'd never reached an agreement, because obviously what had happened, noises off, as it were, on the back rooms, was that the ANC comrades did not agree with the position taken by the ANC negotiators. And so, in a sense, you had to start again.
Well, the Tipex must have been flowing.
Well, whatever it is, yes. Certainly the electrons were flowing through cyberspace at a pretty rapid rate.
And I've got to say, you don't touch on it in the book, but there's something that to me was as an old Lebanese poker player, I've never quite understood how the DA could go into the negotiation explaining what they didn't want to have happen, which of course gave them no leverage whatsoever, which was to keep out the so-called doomsday coalition. Now, I mean, with that public information, it made the DA a little plaything of the ANC. Am I wrong?
Look, I quote a very significant business maven who's based in London now, but ex-South African, Sir Mick Davis, who did make that point to me, and I quote exactly what he says in the book. He said, look, the DA was always playing one trump short, to use an analogy from cards that you'd appreciate. And we were, but, I don't want to sound, sanctimonious about this or vainglorious, but the point is that, Mike, that the DA was absolutely committed to not going into a government that featured the MK or the EFF. And it had that's the one red line it stuck to. And it wasn't because that necessarily would advantage the DA. In fact, as I point out, the DA was disadvantaged by the ultimate deal. But it felt that the country advantage was so much greater if you had a government that excluded the radical elements that would have come in if we hadn't gone in, that, yes, you're right.
But there's obviously two sides to every point, right? The one point is that, yes, the country may not have, in your estimation, wanted this coalition, the Doomsday Coalition. But why was there this feeling that the ANC wanted it? Because to my mind, it was they'd be, and it proved, why did you think that they would want to get into bed with Jacob Zuma and Julius Malema?
Oh, because some of them did want to, and let me just not put that in the past tense, Mike. Some of them still want to. And I, you're a gambling man, and, I like a bet and weighing the odds. I'd take you a pretty handsome bet right now that if Paul Mashatile becomes the ANC president in 2027, his first order of business will be to eject the DA from the Government of National Unity and bring in the EFF. And that was pretty obvious to us from the beginning. And close behind him is the rather ominous figure of Gwedi Mantashe, who I think would more or less, has expressed himself in public. This is no secret. They had said that in public, and they've said it since then. And COSATU, and I quote the president of COSATU, or the Secretary General, was, vehement, even after the GNU is formed, even though COSATU is nominally part of an ANC alliance, or tripartite alliance, said, this is a terrible arrangement, or words to that effect, and we should have an arrangement with the EFF and not with the DA. So it's not that the rabble, as John Steenhuisen rather thoughtfully called them in front of the world at the White House last Wednesday, has gone away. They're still at the gates, and I think the gates will be opened by Mr. or President Mashatile if he comes in. So that is a clear and present danger if, in fact, like me and maybe some of the viewers and you, regard the EFF going into government as a clear and present danger for the country.
See, as though you raised the White House debacle recently where Cyril Ramaphosa was shown a video presentation by Donald Trump. Do you think that...
Sorry, I just need to correct myself. It wasn't COSATU. It was the SA Communist Party.
Yeah.
My correction.
Yeah. But at the White House, you did have the president of COSATU. Only in South Africa could a political leader of some standing say, no, the problem's not the white genocide. The problem's not even murder. The problem is that we rape old women. And you
slit their throats.
Slit their throats. And you're saying this in front of the media. And then you say, please invest in our country. Okay, but that's fine. But the point is this, that now that it's on show to everybody out there, that if a deal is struck with those people showed in the video, specifically Malema, to a degree Zuma, that would be the end of the West for South Africa. Do you think it matters at all with the current people that would favor such an alliance?
I think it matters not a jot to them. And, I'm always reminded of that great economist from 17th century, Adam Smith, who said there's a lot of ruin yet in the nation. And he was talking at a time that the 18th century, when Britain was losing the war in the colonies in America. And there's a lot of ruin left in South Africa in the sense that this is still a significant economy. There are a lot of assets here. There are trillions of rand tied up in savings, pensions, investments, pools. So I think that the comrades would actually go for that and wouldn't give a continental toss about the country welfare. Clearly, they don't care about the country welfare. I don't think the ANC does either, but the Ramaphosa faction, the ANC, is more cautious than the radical faction, which is incautious but is uncaring because they just want to extract more and more and more and more. And what I'm saying about a lot of ruin left in the nation, there's a lot more you can still extract in South Africa from South African savings, from South African pensions, from South African investments. And if you want to plunder and you want piracy as a form of economic policy, you just go ahead and you say, well, I'm going to get what remains, and you can feast for a long time to come. The fact that the country will literally starve in the process is a secondary consideration to a lot of people, despite their rhetoric.
Yeah. So you do the old African leadership thing. You send your kids overseas while you loot the country here.
Oh, and look, another, to quote the book, section of my book deals with Argentina under Peronism, President Kirchner, while I was there. And Argentina was I came back and I told the man who appointed me, President Zuma, I said, Argentina is worse governed and more corrupt than South Africa. And he laughed heartily. And that was the end of my diplomatic career. But it was entirely true. And Argentina was a poster boy for economic extraction by a rapacious president and her cronies. And only when the country literally was on its knees 2 years ago that people said enough is enough, and they elected Millet, which I also describe in the book, because it's almost as though, you have to reach an absolute break point.
Yeah.
And then you say, well, as we say, they don't say in Spanish, we say in Afrikaans, so ver nie verder nie.
Yeah. Let's go back to the GNU talks, and obviously to people who I can't recommend the book enough, so I'm going to leave a lot for you to read. But it seems to me that one of the things that comes up is that an agreement, whether written or a handshake agreement, is meaningless to the ANC.
Absolutely. It's interesting, and I had probably a few. I wasn't an attorney for that long and went into politics, as I described, but I had two legal mentors, and at the firm I was at the time, today it's called ENS, and one is Michael Katz, who's still there, chairman. He was actually at my event on Thursday night, hale and hearty and going strong. And Michael phoned me just after this agreement, and he said something that was profoundly true, and because it then played out for the next 2 weeks while we were trying to allocate the cabinet seats. He said, look, Tony, this is not a legal agreement. Well, it is a legal agreement because you signed it and it's got legal terms, but it's actually a political agreement. Yes. You can't go to court to enforce the terms of it. So he was proven entirely correct. And I had another great legal mentor, Philip Penchars, also the same firm. We once had a very difficult client, and he said to me, Tony, our recalcitrant client believes that a signed written agreement is simply a basis for further negotiation. Mm-hmm. Well, that fitted the ANC to a T because, Imbalula, the Secretary General, went into a fight on television with Helen Zille, and she said to him, and he got very angry, but Fixer, she calls him, you obviously haven't read the agreement that you signed. Well, he was pretty taken aback. It was entirely correct. And even today, the fights in the GNU, the lack of agreement, the lack of processes, all because they were all anticipated, and that's why it's written down. And I claim a contribution here because I'd seen what had happened in the last government of national unity. That was the de Klerk Mandela one, which lasted all of 2 years. And one of the problems was there were no ground rules. Well, the statement of intent we signed on the 14th of June does have ground rules, but the other side seems to regard them as simply words on paper.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned the words better no deal than a bad deal.
Yeah, which you might say, well, why did you agree to this? That certainly was my view and remains a view. But then, once again, as we were getting towards the end of the process, this is in the second half of the GNU negotiations, which are chronicled in the book, Helen Zille actually said, we can't walk out because if we leave the table or the room, we'll be blamed for the failure to have an agreement. The markets will crash, and we've got to have some responsibility. So I'm afraid we're going to have to hold our nose and go. And I was very affected by her view, although we agreed sometimes and then vehemently disagreed, as I chronicle, because Helen started off as very much an opponent to doing business with the ANC and said we shouldn't have a government of national unity or coalition, we should have some loose arrangement. And she progressed along the way because the forces that were, outside the room, the business community, the investors, who are, obviously important not just to the DA but to me as an individual, because you want an economy that's not flat on its back, and you need these folk to keep committed to the country. We're just saying, look, just do a deal, because if you don't do a deal, the alternative is far worse. And that then became the dominant position, and I think it was the correct one. And I must tell you, Mike, as we face the first anniversary of the GNU, I still think it's the correct position, warts and all.
Yeah. Okay. So because, on the issue of an agreement, I've actually seen the agreement that was set up for Gauteng. And I know that it was disregarded, much like...
that was, the king of Gauteng, self-proclaimed Mr. Lesufi.
Yes.
He was truly in bad faith. I don't think the ANC...
that was 100%.
It was shocking. And I do chronicle that. What he did was to say, well, I'll give you a few seats. I won't tell you what they are, and I won't tell you who else will be in the government. Now, if you compare Lesufi's offer to Cyril's offer, though they're notionally from the same party, it was night and day. In that sense, Ramaphosa was, correct, and he acted correctly. And what he said to John in the 2 meetings they had before the finalization, there were several, but the 2 key ones, he basically honored in the end. Lesufi, with respect, was dishonorable from the get-go, and he basically invited the DA to walk away, as they did.
Yes.
And so he heads a minority government.
Yeah, but he was there because they voted for him. So the key was that you were negotiating significant consensus.
Should we not? Yeah, I get what you're saying. The DA shouldn't have supported Lesufi as premier. The problem is his election happened before the agreement was finalized.
Correct, but I mean the same thing even happened nationally, where your thrust was to get the agreement in place,
which we did just.
Yes, but their thrust was to get their hands on power, which at the end was far more important than the agreement, because as we've sketched, the agreement means nothing.
We go back to Mr. Penshaw's. A written agreement simply a basis for further negotiation or ignoring. Yeah.
Okay, and of course the delightful story was that, and please, you've got to read this, was that the ANC finally puts out the final agreement, right? But there's no time for anybody to read it. But you get handed the weirdest lifeline.
Yes, a most extraordinary moment. I mean, this man is apparently, they regard him as some sort of master tactician. Well, at that stage, he was in the EFF. He since joined Mr. Zuma's outfit, and that's Floyd Shivambu, who, bizarre, we would not have voted for Ramaphosa as president absent a signed agreement. Now, you can argue the signed agreement wasn't worth that much. It was better than having nothing. And the ANC knew that. And we were still negotiating these 2 contentious clauses, which Cyril had tried to row back at 6 o'clock in the morning of the day. And I thought, well, this is just disintegrating before it actually the vote happens. And then Shivambu, for some reason, in his EFF capacity, calls for a caucus break. Now, what they were going to caucus about the EFF, I have no idea, but suddenly we were given a half-hour lifeline, and it was exactly from the EFF. So strange happenings at crucial moments.
Yeah, but looking more at the DA side, as we sort of move towards other things as well, Ryan Coetzee probably said it quite well when he said that we're going to land up in a burning house and we won't know how to get out of it. And that seemed to be quite prophetic, because that is what's happened, hasn't it?
I think it's happened to some extent. And I think if there was a mistake, it was a good faith mistake. It was imagining that we could leverage our position as members of a government and get the ANC to act on the basis of a written agreement. Well, we haven't managed to change the course of government policy. And I think that's to the disadvantage of the country, never mind the DA's disadvantage. And we haven't managed to get our full entitlement of positions in government. That was clear. But where the DA has leverage is not actually in the cabinet, it's in parliament. Because the ANC, having generously over-allocated itself positions in cabinet, and even before that and without that, the massive power that's held in the presidency, and I've detailed that in this book, and it's not just my view, the very distinguished jurist Dikgang Moseneke a decade ago said that the overconcentration of power given by the Constitution to the president is a matter of utmost concern, and it remains so. So the ANC started, or anyone who's the president of South Africa starts with an inherent advantage, and anyone who's in the government who's not in the presidency has a disadvantage. Now, that's a constitutional construct, and the ANC, for all its mistakes and misgovernance, has been very careful to keep the power concentrated there. But where the ANC is exposed, if not naked, then semi-clothed, is in Parliament itself, Mike, where it only has 40% of the votes. And the reason, for the first time literally since Union in 1910, is that the government failed not once but twice to pass its budget, which was finally enacted last Wednesday after some changes which the DA had called for, was precisely because the DA's power is in Parliament, where its 22% of the seats is necessary for the ANC to get a majority, unless the ANC relies on rats and mice single-digit parties, in which case it's got to go limp through vote by vote on a very unstable basis. And I think that some lessons have been learned from this budget debacle, that maybe you should treat your senior partners, not 1 seat and 2 seat parties, but a party with 89 seats in Parliament, with a little more respect and circumspection than you've done. Well, let's see we only passed the budget last Wednesday, and here we are just a few days later.
Because even when they went with their tactic of, I call it the Johannesburgification of Parliament to get these one-seat, these Mickey Mouse parties, Action SA, etc., they still couldn't get a majority because they couldn't get everybody there.
Well, and even, not that I'm here to tell the Action SA, who are completely unstrategic and tactically blind, a few lessons. They thought, they'd scored some big wins. They got absolutely nothing out of the process at all, except to once again found that their so-called agreement had been dishonored by the ANC in the final analysis.
Tony, moving more towards DA and its politics, you said something which I thought was unbelievably telling. You mentioned at the critical take it or leave it stage, and I'm quoting, the DA in its current form, if not at the end of the road, then at least, as the election results proved, a significant fork in it. And to sustain the metaphor, the party would on its current voter base soon run out of road. It needed a reformation, though how and whom was unclear.
So I actually was asked by John Steenhuisen before the election, and so we didn't know the results, what my view was the party should do after the election. Well, we didn't know how it would play out the election. And that was my reading then, and I offered him that advice. And he actually quoted that advice back to the party when he said, I think we should go into the government of national unity because we do need a reformation. It's incremental growth. Look, I don't want to gainsay, and I was a person who really played, I don't want to overstate it, but I took the party from 1.7% to 12.5%, and we did that in a very short space of time. And then Helen and John, brief period of Musi, have taken it further to where it is now, which is 22%. So I don't want to underestimate that achievement because no other party trading in the opposition has managed that since 1994. But, it's like a shark. You've got to keep swimming forward, otherwise, you die. So what's the next big step? You can't, you're not going to add a bit here, but you need something more dramatic. The GNU was a dramatic step change. And the one thing I've noted, and I don't know how this is going to play out, the local elections next year, Mike, there's a general election in 4 years' time. But it seems to me that simply by being in government, with all the limitations, all the frustrations, that the DA's electoral appeal has widened just by being in government. So I think a lot of folk who would not have touched the DA with a barge pole at the polling station suddenly say, well, hang on, there's this chap at Home Affairs, he's the DA guy, and he's rooting out corrupt officials. He's, giving millions of people quicker access to life-saving documents like their ID cards. So if he's good enough to be in government and the ANC's, got him at the table, maybe I should give them a second look. And I think you've seen in some of the polls by Brenthurst and the IRR that the DA is actually moving up in the polls a year after this GNU was formed than where it was before the last election, whether it's sustainable or not. So I think and look, the big issue in South African politics, it's clear and present in front of our eyes, Mike, is the continued disintegration of the ANC. And the ANC, the DA might be at a plateau, but it's not going down. It might be going up a bit. The ANC is just going down, down, down. I shared a platform in discussing this book last weekend at the Franschhoek Literary Festival. And my old comrade, but he's a good guy, I've known him for ages, Matthews Pauser, who was the Premier of Mpumalanga and then the Treasurer General, he knows where the bodies are buried. He said words to the effect when we were sharing a News 24 platform at the festival. He said, look, my party did very badly last year's election, 40%. They've learned no lessons from their mistakes. They're going to get 30% in the next election. Now, if he's correct, and this is Matthews Pauser, not Tony Leon, then I think if the DA literally just adds a bit more, you could be even Stevens at the next election. And that'll be interesting.
But yet the DA has completely, by my reading, jettisoned the north of the country. What I got was when you were talking about your time in charge, when at that point the DA was based in up here.
Absolutely.
Right? It seems to has no stomach for the fight up here. You talk about how Cilliers Brink was left out to dry, and at that point I had Cilliers many times. I had Solium Simanga throughout that period of the post-election period, with all of the drama that unfolded, including in the city of Tshwane. The DA seems to, well, certainly the leadership seems to be extremely comfortable in Cape Town, only concerned with itself and its voters, where its lead also seems to be eroding if the by-elections are anything to go by. But it seems like they seem to have no stomach for the fight in the harder fought areas of South Africa.
Well, if that's true, and look, I'm not saying this as a cop-out to your question, which I think is a very important one, but I'm not involved in the management, leadership, or day-to-day goings on the DA, and I don't wish to be. I don't want to rule from the political grave. All I can speak about is my take on this. Joburg is absolutely, as far as I'm concerned, ground zero for any political organization. It is the heart of the country. I say this as a detribalized but very proud. My whole political career was Joburg. I was a Joburg city councillor. I was the MP for Houghton. And when I became the leader of the Democratic Party, because I thought even then there was a pulling towards the Cape and the party was doing very badly in 1994, I immediately abolished the national list of the party and I only had provincial lists, which meant that in order to get elected to parliament, you had to gather votes in the provinces. And that, because the party was over-concentrated, even in 1994, before I became leader, towards Cape Town. So I love the way Cape Town's governed, and I live there. It's a very rational, good place to live. I have high regard for Jordan Hill-Lewis, as I do for Cilliers, as I do for Chris Pappas in KwaZulu-Natal. In fact, all three of them have been involved in my book launches, and I think they are the future of the party, because I think the future does come from the cities and the towns, not just from the top. Having said all that, the party cannot turn us back on Joburg or Pretoria or even Durban.
What do you mean cannot? It has.
Well, if it has, it needs to turn back and face it. I'm not.
Please, you drove to the studio today. Well, surely you can see
it. I
can see, and you're saying that they shouldn't turn their back on it, because quite clearly they have.
Look, I've had some engagement with some of the municipal leadership, just very informally. Pretoria, I saw Cilliers at my book launch, and we had a chat, and he comes out very well, correctly, from my book on his own merits. I've had some contact with some Joburg municipal councils, the DA. I'm very impressed with their commitment. I think it's a very hard job. They need to be single-minded on winning back power in Joburg next year and in Tshwane, and because if we don't do that, not only will the rot continue, but I agree with you, the party's electoral prospects will diminish. And I'll give you another example. I was in England a few weeks ago, when the Conservative Party got absolutely decimated. And they're now trading fourth in the opinion polls. And someone very thoughtfully said, for every Conservative city councillor or municipal councillor that was lost, we lost 4 activists with them, and we've been wiped out in the south of England, which is absolute Tory heartland. So the DA absolutely needs to get serious. I think what it needs to do, and this is just my unsolicited advice, it needs a top-tier person to nominate as the mayoral candidate in Joburg. I think they've got one in Pretoria and Cilliers, very popular. And they need to rally people around him or her, and they need to put all their resources here. I mean, Cape Town is a going concern, and Cape Town can fend on its own, doesn't need too much intervention from the party. But I agree, the north of the country is the pulse of the country.
Now, you seem to have a great relationship with John Steenhuisen. I've had a fraught relationship with John Steenhuisen, who refuses to come onto my show. You say, why is he so reluctant to press for more objective power, the power he holds to pursue his and his party agenda? Now, he seems to be coming second behind Gayton McKenzie in licking Cyril Ramaphosa's boots.
I don't think he should. I never suggest he licks Ramaphosa's boots.
I do.
You think he should?
I think he does.
Sorry, I misunderstood the question.
Yeah.
I don't have that impression. I think he stood up to him. When I was writing about, he was reluctant to push his advantages, and I was comparing the situation with Mandela, which was a different era. where I was leading this tiny party, 7 seats. I mean, John's party was instrumental to there being a majority in Parliament for the governing coalition. Mandela accorded me with fantastic amounts of FaceTime and phone calls and breakfasts and lunches and dinners and birthday parties. And of course, he had another side, Mandela, which I chronicle in the book, which is not without its interest. But I felt that John had he clearly had far more power than I ever enjoyed, because Mandela didn't need me to keep his government afloat. Ramaphosa absolutely needs John's party to keep governing. And I felt there was an initial reluctance. However, I do also chronicle in the book, and it's become, I think, increasingly more obvious, that the DA tactics did start to change and evolve midway or towards the end of last year, and then started actually being much more assertive. And look, I wrote to John the night that we did the agreement, and I was some feeling, and I said, look, you're the first of us ever to enter national power. This is a great moment. But I think that comes with it a whole lot of complexities that I didn't have to deal with. So I'm not sitting as the guy, in the comfort of my lounge saying, do this, do that. I was making that observation. And look, I think it's started to change. The DA is being more assertive in the government. It needs to, absolutely. It's not their grace and favor, thank you very much, donkey boss. They are there because they are the difference between the ANC having a majority in Parliament and not having a majority. And I think they should use it. And I think the budget was a pivotal moment, and was obviously, I could only have 2 paragraphs. I kept trying to stop the printing presses. But there I said, at last, the DA has now pushed the brake and said, so far, no further. So I think tactics...
And the bully did back down.
Well, exactly. Someone said to me about Trump, I was at the same project thing, Taco, Trump always chickens out. Ramaphosa also Ramaphosa always chickens out as well in the end. And we've seen that. And I think you need to work.
He does chicken out on everything except the anti-white rhetoric or the anti-white action. That's when he doesn't chicken out.
Except when he's trying to Donald Trump, then he does. Then he brings an overloaded a caravan of whiteys to help him to explain the South African situation. So I even think that is inconsistent. But I think Ramaphosa's mask does slip. I thought instructively, he, a few weeks ago, speaking at a conference in West Africa, called whites colonizers. And then he called the Afrikaans refugees, who went under a refugee program of Donald Trump, cowards. I thought that was an extraordinary statement. There's some people I respect very much. Reedy Tlabi is one. She lives in Washington, D.C. She left South Africa. Justice Malala, another journalist I very much respect, he lives in Brooklyn, New York. Now, you wouldn't label them cowards. So when people leave the country for whatever reasons, right, wrong, and different, just branding them cowards does show a certain state of mind, let's say, which I find disturbing. But I think, people are so beguiled by Cyril's, smoothness and avuncularity on some occasions and rhetoric that they don't notice when the mask slips, but it does slip.
It's time for our next State of the Nation breakfast, 20th of June at the Sandton Convention Centre, and what a treat. This time, we've got JJ Tabani and Neil De Beer as our guests. I'll be hosting. Book your own table. If you want more details, go to our website, sono.co.za. Book your own table, come on the day, and say hello. Now, you do go to the pains of explaining the ambush around the Musi Maimane label as a failed experiment being not your words at all, but the words of James de Villiers, who I've also had dealings with.
Yes, I certainly did call the Maimane leadership an experiment, but the experiment was based on the fact he hadn't been, the day one in Parliament, the party in its wisdom or lack thereof made him the leader of the opposition. And I just questioned how this could work out, and worked out very badly. I mean, he led the party to a very significant vote-shedding election 2019, and then was called to account by a committee he appointed. I didn't ask to go and investigate what happened. He asked me to with 2 others. And we reached certain conclusions. He didn't like the conclusions. He left the party. And then a few years later, when I was launching my previous book, I was interviewed and they said, Tony Leon talks about the Maimane experiment that failed. Well, it was a failed leadership, but it was leadership based on an experiment that you could take someone day one and make him the leader of the opposition in Parliament, which had never happened before, since, and never should happen again. And, this was a very dramatic headline. Fair enough, they want to sell copies or get clicks. Maimane then took his injured innocence. I'm not your science laboratory experiment. That wasn't the point. He knew that. But, he wanted this. He wanted the sympathy vote. Well, he didn't get many votes anyway.
Yeah.
Sympathy otherwise in the last election. But that's fine. I just wanted to explain how you get this social media frenzy. Well, you know this, Mike, and a lot of your viewers do as well. And I was subject to what James Marburg called 2 weeks hate. It's a phenomenon. And it was quite the best part about that, without boring viewers, but it's in the book. The best part is that I was criticized heavily by one newspaper, particularly the Sowetan. Oh, you call someone a failed experiment, it goes to sort of race holding, blah, they go all this pontificating nonsense. And then Marburg discovered on checking the archive that it was the same newspaper, the Sowetan, when Maimane exited the leadership, who said, well, this is the end of the Maimane experiment. So I'm now being, crucified, or virtually crucified, or in the print, for using a term that the same newspaper that's my chief critic used about him in the same context. It was quite magnificent in its own way.
Do you think that the outcome of the Mmusi Maimane situation and his subsequent exit from the party gave certain people in the Democratic Alliance a massive opportunity to exhale and say, well, thank God we don't have to do that again? Because ever since then, the party seems to be completely blind, deaf and dumb to the need to put on a more acceptable face to the majority of voters.
You mean diverse in sense?
Yeah.
Well, look, I think diversity is very important, although I have to say the biggest issue for Trump is DEI.
Yes,
we are the kind of poster boys of DEI with BE and employment equity. So I don't believe in that forced arrangement or quotas or any of that for very good reason. It's economically ruinous, and I think it's dehumanizing to say someone will, if you're not white, you can't get a job, or the reverse that if you're not black, that was apartheid, and we're reinventing it with modern characteristics. So I don't believe in that. But I don't think you can have, and goes right back to my time. I said my problem when I became the leader of the DP, it was a very small party, is we looked like a combination of the Rand Club and the Broederbond. It was very white and very Afrikaans and very English and few Afrikaans people. And my first job was to actually get the party to have far more Afrikaners in a leadership position. That was quite a battle with some of the purists in the northern suburbs of Joburg. Oh, we don't like these Nats and all that. Well, we got through that. But it didn't end with that. It was just the beginning. And it shouldn't end now. So I do think the party needs to be diverse, but it depends how you create diversity. And I think the problem, and I'm just referencing it because it happened on his watch with the Maimane era, they went for shortcuts. And so in order to prove what they said were non-racial credentials, they went targeting innocent victims. That extraordinary case in Schweizer with that teacher, Miss Barkhuizen, who was really angelic in what she was doing, also looked like an angel, which didn't help her haters. And, she was trashed and traduced by the DA without information. And the party shed 400,000 votes. I think, that was a symbol of that. So doing it like that is just, ridiculous and wrong and unjust. But it doesn't mean that you say, oh, well, we got rid of one issue, now we can just relax. You can't. You can never relax, leader, and you've got to keep trying to make sure that your party looks like South Africa. How you do it, of course, that's the key.
Tony, as we wrap up, we've got the GNU, as imperfect as it is, probably better than the alternative, probably, but it's still work in progress. Would you say that you are more upbeat about the possibilities for South Africa now than what you were before the election of last year?
Well, I certainly was very pessimistic that we could have the worst case scenario, the EFF rising, MK, an alliance, with them and the ANC. I thought that was just the worst, and that hasn't. We've avoided the worst. But what tempers my optimism is the fact that we have minimal growth. We have a mountain of unemployment. And I don't know, and we're buying off people literally with social grants that are unsustainable because we're borrowing so much. And a lot of it comes from foreigners who are going to turn their backs on us, who aren't going to buy our bonds at some point, in which case we'll have a debt crisis. So absent of really tackling some tough decisions, I will revert to being pessimistic. But at the moment, there's at least the opportunity to get onto a higher road, and I would think we must pursue it. Look, the other thing is, as I mentioned in the book, if you look outside the government, outside the state, into the wider society, there's still some good, great, and often extraordinary things happening in South Africa. And despite the worst efforts of our government, I think they'll continue to happen.
Well, Tony Leon, I'm sure if things continue to happen, you're going to have a front row seat because you're always there. And ladies and gentlemen, I cannot recommend this book highly enough. I've got a whole lot more questions that we couldn't even get to. We might have to get Tony Leon back there, but please, consider if you really want a good read and interested in South Africa and how we got to where we were, as well as some wonderful quotes and some wonderful information about people that have crafted the South Africa that we live in today. So we're going to end off by thanking Pace Car Rental for keeping us on air. And most importantly to you that's watching it, please subscribe to our channel. We're on the road to 100,000, not too long to go. Tony Leon, thank you so much for joining us today. We'll see you again on the State of the Nation. Thank you. Every business needs a world-class video to show to your clients and prospective clients. When the Stream-In team isn't filming the State of the Nation, they are producing those world-class videos for companies just like yours. They have got all of the equipment, drones, microphones, whatever you need, and the technical know-how to film a proper video for your company. Visit their website.